March 1971. Quangnam Province, 7 kilometers west of landing zone Baldi. The UH-1H Huey sat, crippled in elephant grass, rotor blades bent at impossible angles. The crew chief was dead, and the NVA were closing in. Specialist Danny Kowalski stood in ankle-deep mud staring at the shattered rotor hub, the thing that kept helicopters in the air, now twisted like a broken toy. He had 15 minutes, maybe less. The math was simple and brutal. Fix this helicopter with duct tape and wire, or die here. So why would anyone attempt something this insane? Because the manual said wait for recovery, and recovery wasn't coming. The enemy was 150 meters out and moving closer. The radio crackled with the same answer. All birds, grounded by weather. Soonest extraction, 3 to 0 minutes. 30 minutes. They didn't have 30 seconds. Small arms fire snapped through the elephant grass. The door gunner answered with short M60 bursts, conserving ammunition, buying time that didn't exist. What Danny Kowalski was about to attempt violated every safety protocol in Army aviation. Remove 2 rotor blades. Balance the remaining 2 with a drill and a prayer. Wrap a cracked rotor mast with safety wire like tourniqueting a wound. Fly a 50-ton death trap 3 kilometers on a rotor system held together by duct tape. And absolutely none of them expected it to work. Danny Kowalski didn't choose Vietnam. The draft lottery chose him. Born in 1949 in Hamtramck, Michigan, a Polish working-class neighborhood inside Detroit, Danny was supposed to take over his father's auto repair shop. He'd grown up there, learning to rebuild carburetors before he could drive, spending Saturdays under Buicks and Chevys while his father chain-smoked Pall Malls and explained how engines breathed. But what really mattered was what his father taught him about metal itself, how it flexed under stress, how cracks propagated through aluminum, how you could feel a failing bearing through vibration before instruments detected it. His father called it having a feel for metal. The Army would call it intuition. Danny just thought of it as listening. His older brother Tommy had done a Marine tour in '67, come back different, and now worked the Ford assembly line without talking much. Danny graduated Hamtramck High in June 1967 with a girlfriend named Linda, a plan for community college, and a future that made sense. Then his draft notice arrived December 10th, 1969, number 47 in the lottery. His father, a Navy Korea veteran, sat at the kitchen table that night, staring at the letter. Danny was 1A. Perfect health, no college enrollment to hide behind. Tommy said nothing. Just drank his Strohs and watched the Tigers game while Danny held Linda's hand and made promises about coming home. Fort Polk, Louisiana. January 1970. 8 weeks of basic training in mud that felt like a preview of Vietnam. Danny scored high enough on mechanical aptitude tests that the Army offered him a choice: infantry or helicopter mechanic school. Tommy had told him one thing about Vietnam: get the hell out of the infantry if you can. Fort Eustis, Virginia. MOS 67 NUH-1, Huey helicopter mechanic. 16 weeks learning the T-53 turbine engine, the main rotor system, the transmission that connected them through forces that could tear metal apart. But what Danny learned in the classroom wasn't what the Vietnam veterans teaching the course actually said. After hours, away from official instruction, the sergeants who'd already served tours would gather students and give the real lessons. Forget the manual when shit hits the fan. One instructor said, a former crew chief with 2 Purple Hearts, you'll have to improvise with whatever you can find. Learn to think, not just wrench. The official lesson: replace damaged rotor blades, never repair them. The unofficial lesson: parts take weeks to arrive. Helicopters are needed now. Figure it out. Danny excelled at both. He could diagnose engine problems by sound, feel transmission wear through vibration in the airframe, spot metal fatigue before it catastrophically failed. His instructors called him a natural. His father had called it listening to what metal wanted to tell you. October 14th, 1970. Danny stepped off a commercial Pan Am 707 at Tan Son Nhut Air Base into heat that punched him in the chest. The smell hit second: jet fuel, diesel, sewage, fish sauce, and something else he couldn't name then, but would never forget: rot. A black sergeant with 280 days in country processed him with mechanical efficiency. "Welcome to the NAM, Cherry. Try not to die." Danny was assigned to the 176th Aviation Company Air Mobile Light, call sign Muskets, based out of Chu Lai. Veterans called him FNG, fucking new guy, until he proved himself. He proved himself in a week. A command and control bird had a mystery vibration that 3 other mechanics couldn't diagnose. Danny spent a night alone with the helicopter, hand on different parts of the airframe, feeling the vibration migrate through metal. Cracked tail rotor drive shaft would have failed catastrophically at altitude, sent the helicopter spinning into the jungle with no way to recover. The pilot bought him a beer. The other mechanics stopped calling him Cherry, but it was what Danny started doing next that made other mechanics nervous. The manuals said to replace damaged rotor blades. Period. But rotor blades took weeks to ship from the States, and the 176th Aviation Company was flying missions every day, wearing out equipment faster than supply chains could replace it. So Danny started cataloging damage. He'd examine bent blades, measure the deformations, calculate whether they could be straightened. He borrowed metalworking tools, taught himself to blend repairs so they didn't create stress points. He'd balance blades by feel, spinning them by hand and sensing where the weight distribution was off. The warrant officers, the pilots who actually flew the missions, quietly encouraged it. They needed birds flying. But the senior mechanics thought Danny was dangerous. "You're going to kill a crew," one told him after finding Danny in the maintenance hangar at 2 a.m., practicing welds on scrap aluminum. "Those blades are damaged for a reason. The manual says replace them because that's what keeps people alive." The maintenance officer officially told him to stop. Unofficially, when they were short on parts and long on missions, he looked the other way. Danny worked alone, more and more. Late nights in the hangar, teaching himself metallurgy from borrowed college textbooks, practicing on parts that were already written off, because some part of him knew the day would come when the manual wouldn't be enough, when following procedures meant death, and the only way out was through improvisation his father had taught him under Michigan cars a lifetime ago. March 1971. The war was winding down. On paper, Nixon's Vietnamization program was transferring responsibility to ARVN forces. American troop levels were dropping. But First Corps, the northernmost sector where Danny worked, was still hot. The NVA and VC weren't cooperating with American withdrawal timelines. The 176th Aviation Company flew everything: combat, assaults, medevac, resupply, VIP transport. They operated from Chu Lai but ranged across Quang Nam and Quang Tin provinces. Here's what nobody back home understood about helicopter warfare in Vietnam. The NVA had adapted. They learned to target helicopters with RPGs during landing and takeoff, the vulnerable moments when the aircraft was slow, predictable, and couldn't maneuver. They'd learned to wait for the rescue birds that always came for downed crews. Every helicopter that went down became bait. The 176th had lost 3 birds in February alone. Replacement aircraft were slow coming. They were flying missions with 60% of authorized strength, pushing crews and machines beyond design limits. The joke was that the helicopters were held together with duct tape, safety wire, and prayer. Danny Kowalski was the guy making that joke reality. But he was about to find out if his improvisations could actually save lives when the enemy didn't give you time to follow the manual. The mission brief had been routine. If anything in Vietnam was routine. Musket 2-3. Piloted by Warrant Officer Carl Peterson, with co-pilot Lieutenant Jeff Rawlings, Crew Chief Specialist Mike Torres, and door gunner Private First Class James Washington, was flying resupply to Firebase Sally, 12 kilometers west of Chu Lai, over triple canopy jungle where the NVA moved freely. Danny had volunteered to ride along. The bird had been having transmission temperature issues, nothing critical, but concerning. He wanted to monitor it in flight conditions. They were 15 minutes out, cruising at 1,500 feet, when Torres spotted movement below. "Got something, 2 o'clock, he called over the intercom. Peterson banked to look. Mistake, because the NVA gun crew had been waiting for exactly that maneuver. The RPG came up through the canopy like a fist of fire. It struck the main rotor mast 2 feet above the transmission, shrapnel shredding the rotor hub and severing control linkages. The helicopter shuddered violently. Peterson fought the cyclic, but the Huey was already falling, auto-rotating but barely controlled, spinning slowly right as the damaged rotor system failed. They hit the elephant grass at 40 knots, skids first, then rolling left as the damaged rotor system couldn't provide balanced lift. Danny felt his ribs crack against the cargo tie-down, heard the rotor blades, still turning from momentum, snapping as they hit the ground. The smell of JP4 fuel flooded the cargo bay instantly. "Out! Everybody out!" Peterson was screaming, dragging Rawlings through the pilot's door. Danny crawled through the cargo door, boots slipping in mud and blood. Torres didn't move. The RPG shrapnel had killed him instantly. Washington was already firing the M60 at the tree line, where muzzle flashes sparkled through the rain. The elephant grass was 8 feet tall, cutting visibility to nothing. Peterson was on the radio. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Musket 2-3. We are down, grid coordinates." The response crackled back through static and rain. "Musket 2-3. Copy your mayday. Be advised all available aircraft engaged or grounded by weather. Soonest extraction, 3 to 0 minutes. Can you hold?" 30 minutes. Danny looked at Washington's M60, at Rawlings fumbling with his M16, at Peterson with his .38 revolver. They had maybe 600 rounds of 7.62 millimeter, 4 magazines of 5.56 millimeter, and a pistol, against an NVA force that, judging by the increasing volume of fire and the Vietnamese voices coordinating movement, numbered at least 20. "Negative," Peterson said into the radio. "Negative. We cannot hold 3 to 0 mics." Vietnamese voices echoed from the tree line, getting closer. They knew the drill. Americans couldn't leave their dead. They'd fight for Torres's body, defend a position they couldn't hold, and die here rather than abandon one of their own. Danny stared at the Huey, mind racing through problems and solutions. Fuel leaking, but not burning yet. Turbine intact. Transmission shut down properly, but the rotor mast was damaged. The rotor hub was shredded. 2 of the main rotor blades were bent at angles that made them useless for generating lift. The manual said, "Helicopter. Unrepairable in field conditions. Wait for recovery." They didn't have recovery. They had 15 minutes before they were overrun. Peterson saw Danny staring at the bird. "Ski! What the hell are you thinking?" Danny pulled his tool bag from the cargo bay. "I'm thinking we fix it and fly out. The rotors are trashed. Not all of them." Danny was already climbing onto the wet fuselage. 2 blades are bent, but 2 are intact. The hub is damaged, but the mast might hold. "If I can balance a 2-blade system, that's suicide ski." Peterson's voice was flat, stating facts. Even if you could balance a 2-blade rotor, which you can't, the vibration would tear the transmission apart in seconds. "You got a better idea?" Danny looked at Washington, who was down to short bursts on the M60, conserving ammunition that wouldn't last. Looked at the tree line, where shadows were moving closer. Looked at Torres's body in the cargo bay. "Because our options are, fix this or die here." Peterson stared at him, then at Torres, then at the jungle that wanted them all dead. "How long?" Peterson asked. 15 minutes, Danny said. "Maybe less. You've got 10. Peterson picked up Torres's M16. "After that, we're overrun whether the bird flies or not." Danny nodded and climbed onto the tilted Huey, toolbox banging against his leg, rain making every surface slick as oil. He had no orders, no manual to follow, no support coming, just his hands, his tools, and 18 months of breaking rules that were about to either save 4 lives or mean nothing at all. Danny stood on the wet fuselage, thinking about vectors, about physics, about every lesson he'd learned tearing down and rebuilding rotor systems. Every rotor system was a balance problem. 4 blades, equally spaced at 90-degree intervals, each tracked to within millimeters. Remove 1 blade and the system tears itself apart from vibration. Remove 2 blades, opposite each other, and you have maybe a chance, if the tracking is perfect. If the remaining blades are balanced perfectly. If the pilot can compensate for completely different flight characteristics. The manual said it was impossible. The manual had never seen Danny Kowalski desperate. He pulled the ratchet from his toolbox and started removing the retention bolts on blade 1, bent 35 degrees at the tip. The bolts were safety-wired, requiring cutting and unwinding before he could turn them. An AK-47 rattled from the tree line. Washington answered with the M60, short controlled bursts. 8 minutes, Ski, Peterson shouted. Blade 1 came off. 30 pounds of aluminum and steel, bent like a broken toy. Danny threw it into the grass and moved to Blade 3. Blade 3 was worse. The RPG shrapnel had torn a 6-inch gash in the leading edge, structural failure waiting to happen at 324 RPM. It came off faster. Half the bolts were already sheared. 2 blades remained. Blade 2 and Blade 4, opposite each other on the hub. Now came the part that would either work or kill them all. Danny pulled himself onto the rotor mast and inspected the hub assembly. The Jesus nut, the single bolt that held the entire rotor system onto the mast, was intact. Miracle number 1. The mast itself seemed straight. Miracle number 2. But the swash plate that controlled blade pitch was damaged. Hydraulic lines severed and leaking fluid. This was the part the manual said couldn't be field repaired. Danny thought about his father's shop, about the time they'd rebuilt a cracked engine block with JB Weld because the customer couldn't afford a replacement. His father's voice. Sometimes good enough beats perfect, Danny, because perfect takes time you don't have. He climbed down, grabbed the emergency repair kit and his paracord, and went back up. A crack ran 4 inches down the rotor mast from where the RPG had hit. Danny pulled safety wire from his pocket, 0.032-inch stainless steel. Started wrapping it around the mast at the crack, tourniqueting the metal like field dressing a wound. 20 wins, pulled tight enough to cut through his gloves, then duct tape over the wire, 3 layers, silver gray against the black mast. The elephant grass rustled 30 meters out. Vietnamese voices, clearer now, coordinating. Contact front! Rawlings fired a burst. 6 minutes! Peterson's voice had an edge now. Danny moved to the blade balancing problem. With only 2 blades, the rotor system was no longer balanced by symmetry. It would vibrate like putting a brick in a washing machine. The transmission would fail within seconds, unless he could balance them. He pulled a grease pencil from his pocket and marked the heavy side of blade 2. He could feel it in the blade's weight distribution when he moved it by hand. Then he did something the manual absolutely forbid. He drilled 3 holes in the trailing edge of Blade 4 to remove weight. The drill was battery-powered, part of his field kit. Each hole took 30 seconds, metal shavings falling into his face, mixing with rain and sweat. An explosion shook the ground. Grenade. 40 meters out. Washington was throwing frags to slow the NVA advance. They're flanking left, Rawlings shouted. 4 minutes, Ski. Danny measured the blade tracking with his eyes, with his hands, with muscle memory. Not perfect, but close. Close enough. Good enough beats perfect. He climbed down and opened the transmission cowling. Oil was leaking from a cracked housing. Without oil pressure, the transmission would seize in minutes. Danny dumped an entire can of STP oil additive into the transmission, then added motor oil from the emergency supply. It wouldn't hold pressure, but it might lubricate long enough. The smell of JP4 fuel was stronger now. One tracer round in the wrong place and the whole bird would become a fireball. Ski! Peterson's voice was desperate. They're 50 meters out on 3 sides. Starting engine in 30 seconds, Danny shouted back. He scrambled into the cargo bay, grabbed Torres's body, couldn't leave him, wouldn't leave him, and dragged him toward the tree line. The body was heavy, made heavier by equipment and mud and death. Danny's ribs screamed where he'd cracked them. An AK-47 opened up, so close Danny could see the muzzle flash. Round snapped past his head. He dove, dragging Torres with him, rolled behind the Huey's tilted fuselage. Forget him, Rawlings screamed. Get the bird started. Fuck you, Danny screamed back. He dragged Torres the last 10 meters and shoved him into the cargo bay. Nobody was getting left behind. Danny climbed into the pilot's seat, hands shaking now from exhaustion and adrenaline. Peterson slid into the left seat, breathing hard. Washington kept the M60 firing, down to his last 100 rounds. Tell me this works, Peterson said. It works, Danny lied. He hit the starter. The T-53 turbine whined, compressor blades spinning up, fuel igniting with a whoosh Danny felt through the airframe. The engine note rose, 20% RPM, 30, 40. The vibration started immediately. The entire helicopter shook like it was tearing itself apart. The cyclic stick bucked in Peterson's hand. Instruments on the panel blurred. The rotor mast, wrapped in wire and duct tape, flexed visibly with each rotation. "Ski, this is going to come apart!" Peterson shouted. "Not yet, it won't." 50% RPM. 60%. The vibration was so severe Danny's vision blurred. He could taste blood where he'd bitten his tongue. The transmission temperature gauge was climbing. 120 degrees, 130, 140. They had maybe 3 minutes before the transmission ceased. An RPG whooshed from the tree line. It passed 3 feet over the rotor disc and exploded in the elephant grass behind them. "Go!" Danny screamed. "Go now!" Peterson pulled collective. The Huey lurched upward, tilted violently left because only 2 blades were generating lift, then nosed down as Peterson fought for control with the jury-rigged mechanical pitch system Danny had cobbled together with paracord. 5 feet off the ground. 10 feet. The rotor mast flexed with each rotation, the wire and duct tape holding, but barely. Rivets were popping from the fuselage from the vibration. Tracers arced up from the jungle, green lines in the rain. One round punched through the cargo bay floor. Another shattered the plexiglass window. Washington was still firing the M60 one-handed, the other hand gripping the deck as the Huey yawed wildly. 15 feet. 20. The transmission temperature hit 180 degrees. Danny knew that at 200, the gears would begin to fail. At 220, it would seize completely and they'd fall from the sky. "How far to friendly lines?" Danny shouted over the turbine scream. 2 clicks. Peterson was fighting the cyclic and collective constantly, compensating for the imbalanced rotor system. Sweat poured down his face despite the rain hammering through the broken window. The Huey nosed forward, accelerating, still vibrating like it was being beaten with hammers. 30 feet altitude, low enough to see individual leaves, high enough that a crash would kill them all. The jungle blurred beneath them. 185 degrees. 190 degrees. The oil pressure gauge was already in the red, pressure dropping as the leaking transmission lost fluid. 1 kilometer. The Huey yawed hard right, Peterson overcorrecting for torque imbalance. He caught it, yawed back left. The mechanical pitch control was working, but it required constant adjustment, constant fighting. An NVA machine gun opened up from a clearing they passed over. Rounds stitched across the underside of the Huey. One punched through Danny's seat 2 inches from his leg. 195 degrees. The transmission was screaming now. Metal on metal, grinding audible even over the turbine. Dark smoke poured from the cowling. "We're not going to make it," Peterson shouted. "Yes, we are." Danny looked ahead, saw the firebase perimeter, concertina wire, bunkers, friendlies waving. 500 meters! You can set down in 400 meters! 200 degrees. The transmission temperature redlined. The oil pressure gauge read 0. 300 meters. The vibration was so severe that Danny's vision tunneled. He gripped the seat frame, watching the instruments, watching the firebase get closer, knowing that at any second the transmission would fail and they'd plummet into the wire. 200 meters. The engine note changed, a grinding sound that meant gears were stripping. The Huey lurched, dropped 10 feet, then recovered as Peterson pulled maximum collective. 100 meters. They were over the wire now, over the perimeter. G is running toward the landing pad. 50 meters. The transmission ceased. The rotor blades stopped turning. For one impossible moment, the Huey hung in the air on momentum and desperation. Then it fell. Peterson auto-rotated with no power, no hydraulics, and 2 rotor blades that barely generated lift. The Huey dropped like a stone. He flared at the last second, nose up, bleeding airspeed for one final burst of lift. The skids hit hard. Shocks collapsed. The fuselage bounced once, settled, silence, except for the turbine winding down and rain hammering on metal. 6 hours later, in the maintenance hangar at Chu Lai, Danny sat on an empty fuel drum and stared at what was left of Musket 2-3. The engineering officer, Captain William Mercer, walked the wreckage slowly, shaking his head. The rotor mast was bent 3 degrees off vertical. The transmission case was cracked in 4 places. The swash plate was held together by paracord and hope. The Jesus nut had hairline fractures from the stress. "This aircraft," Mercer said carefully, "should have killed everyone on board." "Yes, sir." Mercer pulled a beer from his fatigue jacket and handed it to Danny. "You're either the best mechanic I've ever seen or the luckiest son of a bitch in Vietnam." "Both, sir." Warrant Officer Peterson put Danny in for a Silver Star. The citation read, "For gallantry in action while engaged with a hostile force." Specialist Kowalski, with complete disregard for his own safety and under intense enemy fire, performed critical repairs to a downed aircraft, enabling the extraction of the crew from imminent capture or death. It was downgraded to a Bronze Star with Valor by Brigade Command. Danny didn't care about the medal. He cared that Torres's body came home. He cared that Peterson, Rawlings, and Washington lived. Word spread through the company, then the battalion, then the brigade. Within a week, 3 different warrant officers asked Danny to ride with them on sketchy missions, just in case. He became the guy you wanted on board when things went wrong. Nobody officially approved his methods, but when Danny started teaching other mechanics his field repair techniques, nobody stopped him either. The unspoken rule: don't write it down. Don't make it official. But if you're going to die anyway, here's what one guy did once. Danny Kowalski rotated out of Vietnam on May 7th, 1971. He stepped off a commercial, 707, at Travis Air Force Base, wearing his uniform, Bronze Star ribbon on his chest. An older woman in the terminal spat at him, called him a baby killer. Security moved her away. Danny stood there in his dress greens, Torres's blood still under his fingernails no matter how many times he'd scrubbed, and said nothing. His father picked him up at Detroit Metro 2 days later. They drove home to Hamtramck in silence. Danny stared out the window at Michigan Spring, so green, so clean, so far from elephant grass and monsoons and the smell of burning JP4. Linda had moved on. She'd married someone with a college deferment. Danny saw her once at the grocery store. She looked happy. He didn't blame her. For 6 months, Danny tried working at his father's shop, but every time a car backfired, he was under Torres's body again. Every time he smelled gasoline, he was back in the cargo bay, JP4 leaking, waiting for fire. Every time he heard a helicopter, he was 22 years old again, standing on a wet rotor mast with Vietnamese voices closing in. The nightmares started in August. Same dream every night, the rotor mast cracking, the transmission seizing, falling from the sky while Torres screamed in the cargo bay. Danny started drinking to quiet the dreams. His father found him passed out in the shop at 3 a.m., empty Stroh's bottles scattered on the concrete floor. Tommy, who'd barely spoken about his own Vietnam tour, finally said, "You need help, Danny. It doesn't get better on its own." By 1973, Danny had moved out, was working at a Ford plant, and attending VA-sponsored group therapy. The VA doctor called it post-Vietnam syndrome. Danny called it living with ghosts. The U.S. Army Aviation School never officially adopted Danny Kowalski's 2-blade emergency rotor system. It violated too many engineering principles, required too much individual skill, presented too much liability risk. But in 1977, a captain who'd served as a maintenance officer in Vietnam wrote a paper for the Aviation Digest titled Emergency Field Repairs. When the manual isn't enough, it mentioned, without using names, the incident of a crew extracting themselves using innovative interpretation of rotor system redundancies. The paper circulated quietly among warrant officers and maintenance personnel. It became part of the oral tradition of helicopter operations, passed crew to crew, mechanic to mechanic. In 1983, during the invasion of Grenada, a UH-60 Black Hawk crew chief who'd learned about emergency field repairs from a Vietnam-era instructor managed to temporarily balance a damaged rotor using techniques adapted from that war. The helicopter flew 12 miles before the rotor system failed. Everyone survived. In 2004, in Iraq, a maintenance team jerry-rigged a repair using safety wire and duct tape, methods that trace their lineage back to Vietnam-era innovation. The techniques evolved. Materials improved, technology changed, but the core principle remained. Impossible just means nobody's figured it out yet. Danny worked at Ford for 32 years, retiring in 2003 at age 54. He married in 1979, a woman named Patricia who was a nurse and understood that some days were harder than others, some nights required patience, some memories didn't fade. They had 2 kids. Danny taught them how to fix things, how to listen to metal, how to solve problems when the manual wasn't enough. He finally started talking about Vietnam in 1995, when his son asked about the Bronze Star that Patricia had kept in a box. Danny told him the story. His son said, "Dad, that's incredible." Danny said, "No, it was just necessary." That same year, Danny attended his first 176th Aviation Company reunion. He hadn't spoken to Peterson in 24 years. They met in a hotel bar in Atlanta and talked for 6 hours. Peterson had become a commercial pilot. Rawlings was a high school history teacher. Washington had died in 1987. Car accident. Nothing to do with the war except maybe he'd been drinking too much, same as a lot of guys. They visited Torres's grave at Arlington, Section 60. The 3 of them stood in the rain and said goodbye properly, 24 years late. Danny Kowalski died on March 14, 2018, at age 69, from complications of lung cancer. The VA determined it was service-connected, exposure to JP-4 fuel and burning diesel in Vietnam. He was buried at Great Lakes National Cemetery in Holly, Michigan, with military honors. His Bronze Star was on his uniform. At the funeral, his daughter read a letter her father had written but never sent, found in his toolbox after his death. It was addressed to Torres. "Mike, I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I could only bring your body home. I think about you every time I fix something broken. Every time I tell someone that impossible just means harder. Every time I teach my kids that giving up isn't an option when people are counting on you. You were 20 years old. You should have come home. We should have all come home. But we did what we could with what we had. I hope that counts for something. Ski." 73 people attended the funeral. 42 were Vietnam veterans. They saluted when the flag was folded. What would you have done with a shattered helicopter, enemy closing in, and no help coming? Could you have broken every rule, violated every manual, and bet 4 lives on wire and duct tape? Would you have left Torres's body to save time? These are the questions that stay with you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Danny's story hit you hardest? Did you know that helicopters could fly on 2 rotor blades if the mechanic was skilled enough or desperate enough? If you served in Vietnam, or maintained helicopters, or know someone who did, tell us their story. These experiences deserve to be remembered, complications and all. If you believe these stories of ingenuity and courage deserve to be told, even in a controversial war, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the most important innovations happen when following the rules means death. Because mechanics don't get the glory, but they bring people home. Because Danny Kowalski didn't fly that helicopter, but without him, it never would have flown at all. And because even in Vietnam, even in chaos, even in a war we'd rather forget, men like Danny Kowalski showed us what's possible when impossible is the only option you have left.